All right, perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining us here today for advances in engineering biology that are pushing policy boundaries. This is a expert panel between the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, as well as the Engineering Biology Research Consortium, EBRC, that we have here for our special joint issue. So a quick overview on that before we go ahead and get started. Like I said, this is a joint special issue that JSPG and EBRC are partnering on that is going to be on advancing science and technology policy for the next generation bioeconomy. I want to put a plug for anyone here in the audience who is thinking about submitting a paper. Papers are due next week, January 13th. So be getting those final edits in, and we're really excited to see what ideas you guys have for this paper. We have one final expert panel here for you guys before that deadline. And with us today, we have Dr. Nazish Jeffrey from the Federation of American Science, a scientist. We have Dr. Chris Love from MIT, and we have David Tennenhouse here with us from the National Science Foundation. So I'll give a brief introduction of our panelists, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And then during this time, just as some housekeeping, if folks could keep on mute when you aren't talking, we will have time for questions at the very end. So throughout the discussion, be thinking about what questions you will want to have of our panelists here. So a quick background of Dr. Nazish Jeffrey. She is a bioeconomy policy manager with the Federation of American Scientists, focused on biotechnology and bioeconomy policy. Prior to joining FAS, she was a process development scientist in the biotech industry in Boston. She graduated from the University of Rochester School of Medicine with her PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. And during her time in graduate school, she founded the Science Policy Initiative to promote science policy at the graduate level. So we have another science policy folks here during their graduate training. So if folks have questions about that, I'm sure she would be able to answer some questions. And then we also have Dr. Chris Love, who is the Raymond A. and Helen E. St. Laurent Professor of Chemical Engineering, and he's a member of the Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research at MIT, and an associate member at both the Broad Institute and Ragon Institute of Mass General Hospital, MIT, and Harvard. His lab seeks to advance the discovery and development of new therapeutics using techniques such as single-cell analysis and novel biomanufacturing techniques. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from the University of Virginia and PhD in Physical Chemistry at Harvard. In addition, he is also a co-founder of One Site Biotechnologies, Honeycomb Biotechnologies, and Sunflower Therapeutics, and serves as an advisor for multiple other biotech companies. And then we also have Dr. David Tennenhouse here, who is a senior advisor at the National Science Foundation, Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, where he focuses on enhancing U.S. competitiveness through the acceleration of use-inspired translational research and development in fields including synthetic biology and the bioeconomy. He also serves as a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And before joining the NSF, he was the chief research officer at the cloud computing company VMware, where he led activities to enhance and extend VMware's technology leadership. He's also worked with companies such as Microsoft, New Venture Partners, Amazon, Intel, and with the governor at DARPA, and then also was previously on the faculty at MIT. He holds bachelor's and master's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Toronto, and he obtained his PhD at the University of Cambridge. He's a fellow at the IEEE and fellow at the Canadian Academy of Engineering. So welcome to our panelists, and I wanted to get started with each of them to give kind of a brief overview of where they fit in the bioeconomy landscape, and also because we have a lot of folks here who are early career, if you could also give an overview of your own career trajectory and kind of how you wound up where you are now. So I'll go first with who's on my screen. So Chris, I'll start with you.
All right, thanks, Hannah. And hello to everyone. So I'm, as Hannah mentioned, a chemist by training, but I've been at MIT in chemical engineering now for about 15 years. I postdoced briefly at Harvard Medical School in between those two stints working in immunology. So I might be what you would describe in the kind of current parlance as a convergent scientist. I sit at the interdisciplinary space between all these different fields. And I think, that's given us a unique opportunity to really think about a lot of different areas that are relevant in the bioeconomy, mostly in the context of biopharmaceuticals and vaccines, where we've thought a lot about everything from the front end of how do you discover new monoclonal antibodies that might be useful for therapies and improve things like cancer diagnostics, to the back end of thinking about what the challenges are of actually delivering those medicines to patients through manufacturing practices. In regards to kind of how I kind of view what we do as a science in relation to things like policy, a lot of the work that we've done over the last 10 years has really been thinking about how do you enable what I would call small footprint manufacturing technologies. Today, when you maybe think about the bioeconomy and manufacturing, you might think about very large facilities, very large tanks that are designed to ferment and grow cells and to produce products. These are very expensive and very difficult to both operate and maintain. So we've been thinking a lot in our research about how do you create smaller footprint automated manufacturing that could be more broadly accessible and distributed. This has implications both for national security, but also for and rapid response, but also just for growing economic prosperity. And so as we've kind of been thinking about applications for these technologies, we've gotten very interested in where we see some of the boundaries of uptake of some of these new technology innovations in relation to other things that have to happen in the ecosystem to be able to really create new economic growth and development. So I've been involved in a couple of different working groups here at MIT over the last few years, thinking about manufacturing and industrial strategy that are kind of shaping and informing aspects of both the work that we do, but also kind of the opportunities to think about where that fits in the broader community here as well. So I'm looking forward to today.
All right, and Nazish, I'll move on to you.
Thanks, Anna, for that great introduction. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. Like Hannah said, I kind of ended up in science policy in a interesting pathway, I would say. I started off in grad school, not really having an idea as to what I was going to end up doing. Thought I was going to go the academic route like most people do when they go for their PhD. But during my time there, we had an NIH-funded campaign where we were able to bring in a lot of outside people into the university to talk about their own career trajectories. And one of these people was talking about science policy. And that's kind of where I was introduced to the topic for the first time. And it was like the perfect amalgamation of science and policy, the two things that I've always loved in my life, coming together. And so that really sparked an interest, which resulted in me creating the University of Rochester Science Policy Initiative. At my institution. And during my time there, I kind of spearheaded trying to understand what type of skills a graduate student would need to have a career in science policy. And so it meant talking to congressional members, learning how to talk to congressional members, writing policy memos and white papers, and learning how to talk to a whole variety of different audiences. After graduate school, I did end up going into industry for a while just because that transition was a little easier than going straight into science policy. So I spent about a year at Bluebird Bio in process development, where I kind of like really learned what industry was like, especially at the process development stage. And Bluebird Bio is a really unique company in that they're working on curative genomic diseases. And so they're creating therapies for those. And so kind of seeing the inner workings of like what it takes to get a new drug on the market was really enlightening and not something I really experienced in my time during graduate school. And so that was like a really great learning opportunity for me. During my time, I kind of also in graduate school, I also ended up like volunteering and doing some internships with some science policy organizations at the in DC. One of them was the Federation of American Scientists. And so when I saw that they had a job opening there, I applied immediately for it, and I had some background in the bioeconomy. And so I was able to get that position. And now what I do on a day-to-day basis is kind of look at the biotechnology and bioeconomy policy landscape at large at both the federal level and at the state level, and try and understand like what things that we can do as scientists, and what things we can promote in order to really have a great and fulfilled bioeconomy economy for the US. So that means talking to congressional members, that means writing up policy analyses for things that came out. I was a big advocate for the bioeconomy EO that's come out as well. And just like really talking to different agencies and trying to understand the pinch points that they face, as well as the pinch points that different stakeholders face within the bioeconomy. So the manufacturing people, people in different regions, and trying to understand how like biomass really plays a part in that as well.
Fantastic. And now David, on to you.
Well, thank you. I think something I hear in common amongst the three of us is it seems like we've all been a little bit multidisciplinary and been involved in different facets, right? Not just in research per se, been involved both with, kind of some of the research in academia, some of the industry, some of the policy. In my case, it's a little bit of an extreme of that because I'm really a computer networking and systems person by training and through a lot of my career, right? So I don't bring bio expertise to the table per se. And even my policy expertise really came from work in telecom and privacy and other areas related to the tech industry as opposed to, say, bioregulation. I think the thing that I have kind of brought through my career is having spent time, in academia, in industry with big companies, with startups as a VC, in government with DARPA and NSF. So I'm sort of able to, when I go into a meeting, put myself in the shoes of the different people around the table. And this particularly comes up whether it's a business meeting or a bio meeting or a new what's a strategy, either industry at the individual company level or at a government level. What should our strategy be for the bioeconomy? So as it turns out, I've been really fortunate to have been engaged on and off with the synthetic biology community, now often referred to as the engineered biology community, since kind of the late 90s. At that time, DARPA was just realized we needed to get into biotech, but we didn't have a bio office. There's now a bio office at DARPA, but there wasn't at the time. So we made some of our first investments out of the IT office that I drove and out of a different office called the Defense Science Office. So that kind of got me in touch with this community. And it seems like over the years, every so often I get back in touch with it. Today, I've been very involved in helping the NSF stand up its new TIP directorate. So using that experience, having been kind of, in the tech world, in industry, in academia, in government. Now, how does government get much more involved in accelerating the process of research translation? And TIP's trying to do that across a wide range of technologies, one of which is biotech. And so over the past couple of years, I was helping TIP get new initiatives going, particularly on accelerating the translation of research in computational protein design and cell-free processing. Those were just kind of like the first two things that we said, okay, let's, we need to get started somewhere. Those look like they're ripe for translation. There's been sort of, for about 20 years of work in SynBio. And they seem to be good places to get things moving. So, and look for more, right? They won't be the only things that we do.
That's great. Thank you so much for that overview of all of your careers. So I wanted to kind of dive into some of the key issues in the bioeconomy that some folks in our audience might be interested in as they're writing their papers or as they're interested in just learning more about this topic. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you all see the biggest opportunities ahead for the bioeconomy, and how do you really think that policymakers can help the scientific and engineering and community across academia, industry, nonprofits really sort of take advantage of those opportunities? I'll let folks start when they have an answer.
Okay, I'll dive in and just say, I think it's like there's human therapeutics and there's everything else, right? And human therapeutics, as a former VC, are where the money is. That's where the great big exits are. It's actually a really, it's a long and difficult path. However, it's kind of a well-known and well-understood path. So, regulatory-wise, in particular, it's kind of fairly heavy-duty regulation. You've got a lot of hoops to get through. It's hard to get through them, but you know what they are, right? So investors really like certainty. So having said that, if you, on the other hand, say, well, where can you have the most impact on our economy? Right? If we talk about the bioeconomy, where are we going to have the most impact on the economy? Well, then I think it's like everything else. Agriculture, biomanufacturing, potential impact on sustainability. These are places where there's I think opportunities to create whole new industries, reinvent existing industries, et cetera, and really, impact a huge fraction of the GDP. So I view this as kind of like from a government point of view, almost, NIH really leading the charge on the human therapeutics. And then, other agencies really need to step up to the plate and figure out how to do things in those other areas that are really, really great opportunities. And those don't attract the same level of VC investment. So there's a really important role for policymakers to help those new technologies get across the starting point and eventually get across the finish line.
I think I'll jump in. I think, David, completely agree with you on your analysis of that. I think, and to your point about VCs being a little bit more hesitant to kind of invest in that space, I think that's another area where, the government can really step in to help de-risk the sector at large. It really does need to have this public-private partnership kind of emphasis that needs to come out of the government in order to help de-risk the sector so that there's more investment and that these different type of technologies can actually come to market. There's a lot of potential within the bioeconomy and the different sectors that fall within the bioeconomy to really alleviate a lot of societal problems, but we need time and it needs investment into it in order to do so. In addition to that, just like promoting more regional networking and different types of economies within the regions is going to be really important as well, because each region houses different resources. And so if the US government is able to take advantage of that, kind of promote more jobs in those areas, different types of manufacturing, biomanufacturing, and utilization of biomass and these resources, then I think there's like a large play to be had here that can be really great for our economy at large and for the people that serve our nation.
I think maybe I'll just pick up and amplify on a couple of points you guys are made. I think one thing that's probably worth, everybody here on the call is probably a big fan of the bioeconomy. That's probably why you're here, is that I think in a lot of ways, this has the potential to be the greatest industrial revolution. It's going to build on all of these ones that have come before. Apologies to those that maybe came from semiconductors and other spaces, but it's all of those capabilities that are going to really truly enable the bioeconomy to be what it is potentially able to do through biology, with the differentiated factors that it's both going to be sustainable and, from a policy standpoint, if we do this correctly, accessible. And what I mean by that is both affordable and available. And I think, one of the things that's already been highlighted is the potential of the bioeconomy and synthetic biology, all of these different tools to make a wide number of things, not just human therapeutics. But what we need to be mindful of, particularly as policymakers, is that we want to be able to accomplish this on a short time scale, given a number of other factors, both geopolitical and kind of within the kind of climate circumstances. We need to be making gains in this in a short time frame. And we need to make sure that everyone in the country and across the globe has an opportunity to participate in this. And so I feel like this is a place where policy becomes even more important, because we are sitting at the front end of this, unlike, say, semiconductors or AI and social online technologies. There's an opportunity for policy to be put in place that's actually enabling and the uptake of these technologies and these ideas into the broader sector that benefits everyone and not just a certain sector of the population.
And I think that's a really key point, is that accessibility piece. And so we're talking about these big opportunities, but I also want to shift to like, where are the pitfalls that you see that are currently either restricting advancements in the bioeconomy, or that you see coming up ahead that people need to be prepared for as we're trying to scale up the bioeconomy? And how do you see them impacting the current policy landscape that we're in?
I want to try to let somebody else go first.
I'll start, and then maybe we'll go back through the other direction or something here.
Perfect.
I guess there's kind of two that I would highlight. One builds off what I said in my first comment, which is really thinking about how do we promote and educate in the communities that are going to participate as part of this, so that they understand how it is that we can build this bioeconomy together. And the other is expanding support and emphasis on the science of biomanufacturing. I'll talk a little bit about both of these briefly. The bioeconomy, I think, is something that really has the potential to have prosperity all across the United States and around the world. These technologies, as we've kind of already talked about a little bit here, can take advantage of regional resources in ways that you don't necessarily have in other places. There's not an oil reserve in the ground that you have to be located over. You need water and energy. I think craft brewing is a really great example of a local regional bioeconomy that exists today, but now accounts for something like 25% of all beer produced in the United States. It has an enormous potential to do this for other kinds of goods, as we've talked about and thought about here, for agriculture, other kinds of products. But we have to kind of work with local and regional governments to really talk about what this could be and how to partner with them. And then I think the other thing is the United States is clearly the leader in innovation on what I would call the front end of biotechnologies today. We know how to ideate lots of great things, but there's a big difference between me making something in my lab here at MIT and getting it to scale for delivery into the commercial markets. That scaling process requires manufacturing. Yet as a country and really as a planet, we have done a poor job in investing in the last 50 years in the actual science of biomanufacturing. We're still using a lot of the same technologies and principles that were developed many, many years ago. And those, with all the other advances in AI, automation, semiconductors, bioengineering itself, there's a lot of opportunity to really advance and innovate new kinds of ways to make these materials that are sustainable and affordable and accessible. So I think, as we look at where the opportunities are from a policy standpoint, how do we think about the right investments to really kickstart new innovations in that reduce the barrier to entry to manufacturing?
Yeah, I think those are really great points, Chris, especially the cost of scale. It's something that's definitely a hindrance within the bioeconomy. And especially getting CapEx, so these large materials, these fermentation tanks, and being able to actually prove concept at a larger and larger scale becomes more difficult and takes time and money. And it's a very risk-heavy area. And so that's definitely a pitfall within the bioeconomy right now that needs more investment and public-private partnerships in order to really advance, as well as looking at other ways that we have promoted different industries, the semiconductor industry, for example, or even the clean energy, where we have carbon accounting credits currently really boosting that area. How do you translate those types of programs that have worked for different technologies, but how do you translate it for things that the bioeconomy needs? In addition to that, I think it's really important to talk about the education that's also needed within the bioeconomy as well. And it's not just at the graduate level, it's also at the K through 12 STEM education level. It's at the community college level and the undergraduate level and certification level, where people have had the skills of manufacturing, but they don't know how to translate it to become biomanufacturing. And so this is something that needs to happen at all levels of government, both the federal and state level, in order to really bring up our capacity and our ability to do the work that is needed long term for the bioeconomy.
So I'm definitely going to agree with those comments, and particularly, I think, Chris, the only part I'll disagree a little is like it's almost the engineering of biomanufacturing as opposed to the science of, but that's that's in the in the details. But I think really bringing as I say, like an engineering research mindset to the and in some sense getting people interested and excited about how do I really engineer these things and make them happen at the manufacturing end. And I think there's huge opportunities there. There's huge opportunities also, by the way, to use the progress we've made in engineered biology to help with the biomanufacturing. So, for example, engineered biosensors that we can put into the manufacturing process to instrument it as we're going along, and do a much, much better job of instrumenting it, would just be an example. I also agree with you that there's, I think, challenges at multiple scales. Ultimately the great big manufacturing scale, but also even just getting from sort of lab scale to development scale. I mean, a lot of people sort of want to, immediately build the $1 billion pilot facility, but there's steps along the way that we also have gaps in. So I think there's various gaps there. I though also like to just sort of zoom out a bit, and I like to think about the ecosystem as a whole, or say, for any given innovation, it's going to succeed or die within an ecosystem, that it requires. So I think we need to pay often a lot more attention to things like the supply chain around that innovation. We sometimes go like straight to the startup and launch the startups in the absence of the things around it that the startup's going to need. It's going to need suppliers. It's going to need its customers to be ready to buy that stuff when the new product is ready. Say for example, it's a new ag product. Well, is the ag distribution network going to be ready? That requires road mapping. EBRC does a great job of research road mapping. Now, can we start extending that road mapping concept to the development phase so that we can get kind of the different participants in the ecosystem aligned? I also do think that as we get outside of sort of FDA territory, we really need to improve the regulatory clarity. And I think that a lot of that would be best done, to be honest, outside of government, right? Through, sort of self-regulation, through standards, through other mechanisms, through transparency. Transparency can often be a really great alternative to regulation. Regulation often comes in when something's gone wrong, right? And people, need to crack something that's been very secretive open to find out, to now police it. Can we get ahead of that by, encouraging, there's, ethics and values, there's transparency, there's standards, a whole bunch of, self-regulatory steps that could help us. And I will say, just to drill into kind of one example there, that a colleague, actually one of Chris's colleagues at MIT pointed me at is preparing the groundwork for safe open release. Both inside the manufacturing factory, we're going to be exposing people to a lot of stuff. If we start using this stuff, for agriculture or environmental purposes, it's going to be out there. How do we get much better prepared for safe open release and establish the standards for that and the roadmap for that, et cetera? Those are, I think, all really important policy things to be addressed.
Absolutely. And, I also wanted to kind of dive into, given that the name of the session is on technologies that are really kind of pushing those boundaries that we currently have in our policy landscape. I was wondering if any of you thought of a particular kind of technology or area of technology that you see as really kind of pushing the envelope in the policy landscape around the bioeconomy.
I'll start this one off. I don't know of any technologies off the top of my head, but I will say that the things that are happening in the agricultural field for the bioeconomy is really impressive. And I think it's really driving the conversation at the policy level too, just because we've had the Farm Bill talks for a while now. And so it's a really great policy window and opportunity for people to talk about agricultural research and what's needed and the different sciences that are needed in order to push those innovations forward, especially with the products that they're now making. And it kind of brings up to David's point about the different regulatory needs that are going to be popping up as a result of all these conversations as well. But I definitely see ag and like food and water security being something that needs to be at top of policymakers' minds when they're thinking about this.
Chris, do you want to jump in and then I'll go?
Sure. So, I think, as I was thinking about this, Hannah, the technology base that I see that's emerging is really the capability of manufacturing with biology anywhere. We and others have worked on what we call kind of small footprint manufacturing solutions. And, in some of the work that we've done here at MIT and a company that I helped co-found, Sunflower, they've demonstrated that you can actually make drug substance materials in, austere environments like warehouses that are meeting the clinical requirements necessary to use them as biopharmaceuticals. This capability is something that our regulators aren't really prepared to think about from an FDA perspective. What does it mean when your facility isn't a street address that you have in one location, but really could be anywhere, like an inkjet printer? You have to remember that today, centralized manufacturing of pages, like printing, I know we all do things online now, but we still print a lot globally. Distributed manufacturing with like inkjet printers and such is almost the same volume per year. The technologies now to do this in the bioeconomy are emerging. There are other examples in cell therapies and in mRNA production. plasmid production that are all at that type of small local regional scale. What does it mean to regulate in that sort of distributed environment? The FDA has started some of these conversations. I've participated in some workshops as well as others to kind of grapple with that question. But like, what does it mean when anybody can participate in the bioeconomy? And kind of maybe touching on David's point of like, how do we have the standards and sort of the open, transparent approaches so that maybe not all of those have to be regulated the same way, or maybe there's aspects of the manufacturing practice itself that are sort of spoken for in a defined way, much like we do with biomedical devices. So there's some interesting kind of questions embedded in kind of how we enable these technologies.
So you just inspired me to go down a slightly different direction than my prepared answer, which is to kind of riff on this. One of the areas that we've recently run a solicitation on is cell-free manufacturing. And what I'm going to say is that initially, when I first learned about this is something that I really didn't like as a topic, because you look at it and you see the way this works is you typically have to go use cells to create these reagents, which you then use those reagents in a cell-free process. So it seemed like, well, hold it, this is going to be more expensive, right? This seems like a bad idea. But as I looked at it more carefully, I started realizing that a lot of the things that drove up costs weren't fundamental, right? So it's like, this comes from, I guess, a history in the Moore's Law world that says, well, okay, start looking at what are the fundamental limits and versus things that over time you can eliminate. So I started getting more excited about it. Where I'm going to relate this to your comments, Chris, is both. Now you can separate. Imagine you have cell-based manufacturing that gets you part way, and then the cell-free can be done out in the field, right? You use those reagents. So right now you need standardization because you've got you've split the manufacturing into two steps, and you better make sure that there's some understanding of the quality of the reagents and how long they're going to last and shelf, all of that, right? And the storage requirements. But if you can do it, I think one aspect is that you could get that decentralization. I'm not saying other types of cell-based manufacturing could also get you there, but I'm just saying this is one that really gets you there quickly, all the way to things that are almost like the sort of test like systems test strips that we have today. So you could just print off test strips, but where they're actually doing protein translation as part of it. But the other thing I was going to say is, even if you have larger scale manufacturing, you now have the opportunity to actually use the same manufacturing stuff to make a lot of different products. So you start having a possibility of being able to retarget your manufacturing capabilities. They can be sort of like almost neutral. And depending on what I need when, I can actually put different things into place and into production. Whereas, if you're doing fully cell-based manufacturing, actually it takes you quite a while to stabilize the process. And once you've got it up and running, you probably want to keep running it for quite a while. So you better, run it in volume. So I just think we are opening the door. I was just using that as an example. It's not the only example. I'm not saying you can't do the cell-based. I'm just saying it's an exemplar where we can both get the decentralized aspect, and even in other cases get this notion of a retargetable manufacturing base, and that's also a really big change. So
David,
and I know you included the retargetable, like that 3D print. The printing's definitely got that retargetable part. So I'm not saying you weren't including it. I just wanted to draw it out for the audience that those are two interesting vectors.
Yeah, and David, if I can just briefly, I'll piggyback on that just to say that, like, I think you've highlighted a really important point about the bioeconomy, and as we think about these technologies as a whole, which is that there are going to be many technologies that are going to be required to kind of have the full breadth of the bioeconomy. There's cell-free and cell technologies, and mRNA, and all of these are going to contribute. So we, from a policy perspective, need to make sure that we're not pigeonholing and selecting out early winners at the loss of some of these other ones. Biology can do so many things. We have to be really careful about not picking one winner too early.
This is, as I said, this was certainly just one thrust of what I hope will eventually be many. I just will also, and I should have said, I do want to put in a push for computational protein design, because I do think that's another example of something that opens up a lot of doors. It's also an example of something you mentioned earlier, Chris, about how, work in the, computer side of the world is, a lot of the value may come out in how it gets used by the bio side. And it's sort of an enabler of a much bigger revolution.
And a leveler. I think having AI tools and ML tools that facilitate things like protein design or strain engineering or process design, those are things that now anybody can access because the complexity is built into the tool. You don't have to be an expert knowing how that works in order to actually participate and engage in bringing your idea forward.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to ask one more question before I turn it over to the audience. So folks in the audience, be thinking about what questions you want to ask our panelists. So turning back to our panelists, so one question that, I think would be of interest to many of the folks on this call is, what are some opportunities that you see for the public and the private sector to work together to drive innovation in the bioeconomy? Because, we have all these new technologies coming out of our labs as well as going into industry. And where do you see the sort of those ripe areas for partnerships between these two sectors?
Well, I guess it might be back to me to go first. I'm not sure. I'll take a crack. So I'm going to, try to divide this up. There's, large companies and VC-funded startups will go after the parts of the ecosystems that are most lucrative, right? So, we talked before about human therapeutics, but even say within agriculture, et cetera, they'll sort of build up the company that sells the final product where the most value is extracted. So, I think government should partner there, and it already does. You've got programs like SBR, et cetera, but I think that's in pretty good shape. I think there's another part that really gets understated. We almost have a over fixation, again, as a former VC, with the VC style startup, and we forget that most of our economy is about small and medium-sized businesses. And if you think about the ecosystems, again, that a startup lives in, it needs things like test labs, right? It needs things like SROs. It needs, it needs suppliers. It needs all sorts of other things. And so I guess what I'm saying is, I think there's a really important role for the public sector to also engage with sort of the creation of these things that they may be not for profits, or they may actually be very decent for profits, but they're never going to generate enormous VC exits, right? So they're going to be really nice, small, like a testing lab. It might be a for-profit testing lab, but it won't necessarily be $1 billion VC exit. It'll just be a nice business that, feeds people's families and everything else, and is critical to parts of the bioeconomy. So I think we need to actually figure out, and particularly, I think the public sector needs to sort of figure out how to engage in the creation of the parts of the ecosystem that won't otherwise be created, because they're not where the high value extraction occurs, but they're absolutely critical to making it possible to extract that value.
To piggyback off of your answer a little bit, David, there, I think infrastructure, as you kind of mentioned, is extremely important. That's going to be needed for the bioeconomy long term. And it's somewhere that the government is just now starting to understand. Just like you mentioned, we need some of these more localized facilities in manufacturing areas and capacity. But not only that, but we also need the energy behind all of this in order to actually energize the production of all these things that we want to make in the future. So it's going to be really important for like the private sectors to be vocal about, what are their energy needs? What are their water needs? How do you make the water that they use sustainable in a way that's still green and effective and doesn't add to our carbon emissions that we have right now? And so there's also an opportunity to bring different types of sectors, different private sectors into these conversations that I think the bioeconomy at large does struggle with to this day. Sometimes I have these conversations with these different groups of people, especially the climate people, that feel like, oh, we're not part of the bioeconomy at large just because we are so different than what the bioeconomy is. And it's like once you start breaking down those barriers, you're like, no, you are one facet of the bioeconomy. And it's important to put that lens of sustainability and environmental consciousness over the larger landscape of the bioeconomy in order to succeed in what the mission statement is. In addition to that, I think it's really important to mention that the bioeconomy is difficult because it does encompass so many different sectors. And I think the government at large has been struggling to figure out the best way to have their own agencies work together as a result of that. I think the Bioeconomy Executive Order was a really great start in building a strategy as to how these agencies can play together. But I think it needs for a follow-up in order to really create something that's going to be long lasting.
I know we probably have a lot of great questions, so I'll just say briefly, and I think it's great because we've kind of tied back together a number of themes here in this last part, and highlighting small and medium enterprises as a part of the overall supply chain and robustness of the economy is something that we have to not lose sight of. And so I think there's a couple of implications there. I think one is we need to make sure that whatever policies we're putting in place make it possible for small and medium enterprises to exist and operate. Something like 40% of all goods that are produced in the US that are sold business to business or to consumers are made by small and medium enterprises. What does this look like in the bioeconomy, and how do we make sure that the technologies are accessible to them? A lot of these in the material sector are things just like machine shops. What are the tools that need to be available, at a local or regional level to be able to do that? What are the right structures to make sure that we don't have premature consolidation of technologies, right? We run the risk of IP being locked up in certain ways. This has happened before in the biopharmaceutical industry. What are the right policy of tools to make sure that the kind of baseline pre-competitive knowledge in this space is available widely? CRISPR-Cas9 is a good example of a technology that's sort of been in the news on that front lately. What's the right way to manage that? I don't know. One thing that we've tried to do at MIT is to think about academic industry partnerships as pre-competitive strategies to address these questions. I direct a consortium here called the Alternative Host Research Consortium that we started with the biopharmaceutical industry and now has expanded to other parts of the sector, other sectors, to really think about what's the pre-competitive engineering of host strains that could offer next generation manufacturing solutions for lower cost, higher volume biopharmaceuticals or food ingredients, things of these types. In doing so, right, it sort of sets a level set of like, here's what is pre-competitive before you go off thinking about product and development. Maybe there's other mechanisms or tools like that that could help from a policy standpoint assure that across the supply chain.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to our panelists. And I wanted to open it up to the audience. If folks have questions, please raise your hand. You can speak your question out loud, put it in the chat, but I want to open that up for folks that we have on the call with us. So I see a question from Jonathan. Jonathan, do you want to ask your question out loud or keep it in the chat?
I guess I can ask it out loud. But I have some people behind me, so I won't turn on my camera. I was just wondering, how do you balance this, creating this diffuse distributed economy where benefits can be seen locally, where you're using local feedstocks, with actually creating scale where automation is economically viable and you can make products cost effective? Because I think that's a running theme in the bioeconomy is this we can create something where there's you don't have to concentrate everything in one place, where the benefits can be more distributed and whatnot. But I feel like these legacy manufacturing systems is, well, you need to bring everything together so you can achieve these economies of scale. And so how do you guys see maybe that polarity playing out? Yeah.
I could start, and then others may have some thoughts here as well. I think one thing is this is sort of asking the question of scale up versus scale out. And we've seen in other industries where scale out can be cost competitive. I'll come back to the printing example. An inkjet printer page is like a couple of cents. Now, that's not the same as maybe producing a biopharmaceutical at that same point and having the economies of scale that go with that. But there is an inflection point where you start to scale out that lowers the cost in production. We've modeled some of this for biopharmaceuticals and shown that you can actually get to regionalized vaccine production that would be as affordable as very large scale manufacturing as it's currently done in very few centralized plants. So I think, that's one lever in that. And then at the others, what I'll come back to, and David may want to pick up on this a little more, is this idea of going from the bench into commercial introduction and then to large scale. There will be products that require very, very large scale manufacturing for a variety of reasons, chemicals probably being one of the better ones. To think about there, but there's a lot of products that the bioeconomy will enable where you don't necessarily need that scale to be able to enter into the market. And now having distributed or scaling out capability is really important. Estimating how big to build that plant up front is often really hard to do before you know what the commercial demand is going to be. And so I think, again, this kind of comes back to the need to have technologies that really can go across those scales to build out the ecosystem. So our natural tendency is to think big, but we should be thinking out as well.
So I guess, I have sort of a mix of comments here. One, in terms of the scale up and scale out, and I think that is a great analogy, is that sometimes we should also realize, what are we most likely to be good at, right? And I think, where our economy, we're really good at innovating the new thing. And sometimes once something gets like really well understood how to do it, other countries copy us and, maybe it's time for us to move on. So focusing in some sense on the, what Chris described as the scale out could be advantageous to us, right? Because it could just work and keep us in our sweet spot. Having said that, I think there'll probably also be places where you're really going to want to match the scale to the component. And this is, it was just, the cell-free was just one example, but we should, kind of divide up the manufacturing process and think about, okay, to the extent we can separate it out into different steps. There may be parts of that I want to do scale up and parts I want to do scale out. And your printing example is a good one because, the cartridges themselves, well, those we sort of make in a factory that pumps out cartridges, right? For a whole bunch of reasons. And so it's that really nice combo, and that separation of the parts is really, what makes that possible. The other thing I'll say is when we talk about economy of scale, there are some places where it truly is an economy of scale. In many places, it's an economy of learning. And what I mean by that is, we learned a long time ago, the more you make of something, it's kind of like, and I forget the exact rule here, but it's something like, each order of magnitude increase in the kind of the volume, and here I mean the quantity, not how, number of units, creates sort of, something like a, 50% improvement in the cost factor. But it's coming from learning, right? So it's like if you make a large number of aircraft of all the same aircraft, you learn how to make them really, really well. This was a learning during World War II. So what I'm saying there is with today's technology, you can imagine having the unit volume being very distributed, but you're feeding back the learning because you've instrumented all of that manufacturing, and you're getting the aggregate value of the learning across the base. So we need to be smart enough about how to do that, but it's possible to do that. So if you could capture that economy of learning while, sort of doing the scale out, I'm guessing you would get a huge fraction of the benefit of economy of scale. So it's just a thought there. And similarly, as we think about how we could instrument this more scale out, it's also about like, QA and oversight. The other reason to do things centrally is for QA and regulatory and other reasons. Well, again, good instrumentation. We know how to network things, and we can flow the data back. So I think there's really great opportunities here, and it goes back to Chris's point about an opportunity to innovate in the process and how we do things, not just what we do, what we build.
I did want to say also to kind of bring this conversation around is that while, yes, we do want a distributed bioeconomy, that doesn't necessarily preclude us from having sectors of excellence or sectors of where things are going to happen. Like there's always going to be the large manufacturing that has to happen. But if, say, Iowa is really big on corn, can they focus their manufacturing that's centered around corn then and have those industries built there? And that way you don't have to ship corn from Iowa to somewhere else in order to do what you need to do. And same with like North Carolina, how can they take their resources and understand what they have there in those regions and promote those and build in the infrastructure that's needed in order to do so. And so it's distributed in the sense that these different regions now understand the resources that they have and they capitalize on those resources in order to make their own bioeconomies. I like to call them microbioeconomies, but that's not a term that's been caught on quite yet. But each of these little bioeconomies have the potential to make the larger bioeconomy, the larger US bioeconomy, more fluent and has the ability to address more of the environmental concerns at each of these different regions that the federal government just cannot touch because it's so vast and there's so many different landscapes across the US that need to be understood and dealt with that the regions have a better handle on than the US government ever will.
Thank you. Do other folks in the audience have questions? Well, while we wait, I can ask here of, one of the things that we often hear people in the policy space talking about is how do we craft our policies, whether it be legislative, regulatory, local, state, federal, how do we craft these policies in a way that doesn't stifle this industry, but helps it move forward and really supports that innovation in the bioeconomy. And then I think also on top of that, one of the things that, we've been talking about in some of our previous panels were how do we do that in a way that helps promote sustainability in the bioeconomy so that it is really focusing on that sustainability piece, both in terms of being able to have this sector grow into the long term, while also, sustainability also in terms of environmental sustainability as well.
I'll take the first crack at that. At least for me, from what I've experienced within the bioeconomy and working with different stakeholders, the thing that I've really noticed is that having everybody at the table really helps bring those conversations along. And oftentimes that these conversations are happening, not everybody's at the table. And I'm talking about, sometimes if you're talking about ag, bring the farmers to that table to understand their perspectives, bring the people that are supplying the feed for those farmers and so on and so forth. Or if you're talking more in an industrial setting, who are the ones that are making the plastics that are needed in order to make this biomanufacturing product? What about the transportation people that are involved in this process? How do you bring all those groups of people together in order to really understand what the regulatory hurdles are and what the environmental hurdles are and how do you fix them? Because if you don't have those conversations, you're not going to ever really understand the full scope of what those challenges are.
So I'd really agree with that. I think Nazisha's made some really key points. I also think getting different folks around the table, really understanding what their barriers are, what's holding things. I'm always with people like, what would help you go faster, right? Is a key question we need to keep asking. And at the same time, I think trying to engage earlier on policy and having the communities do it themselves, it is much better. So I think of it as earlier and lighter, right? Don't wait for the disaster to happen and then for some, I guess at a point where the public is demanding regulation means you've waited way too late. So much better to get in earlier, and I think it creates opportunities for self-regulation, opportunities to do things later. I mentioned transparency earlier, can be really effective, I also think that there's a certain amount of instilling a set of common values in the community of people, and maybe this comes back to having enough people around the table so that they're an acceptable set of values in the community of people that are kind of practicing within whichever subfield it is, so that people kind of they have a common understanding of, okay, this is what we think is safe. This is what we think in terms of biosecurity is okay, and this is what isn't. And there's a certain amount of self-policing that just happens in the community. I mean, you just can't and shouldn't do everything by rules, right? It's just kind of, I guess there's been a lot of discussion in the political sphere about norms here. In the past, few years, norms are really important. And I think helping these communities, I really like Nazish's comments about that, pulling all the stakeholders together, but helping them to figure out what the norms are and instill knowledge of those norms in the people that are practicing.
So Jonathan, I see we have your hand up.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. I guess I want to come back to this like economy of learning, and also how the bioeconomy is like still pretty nascent. There's this lack of like standards and technologies, and how like it would really benefit if people came together and kind of help build those out and maybe create this like sharing of learning and whatnot. But how do we develop this if traditionally commercialization has relied on proprietary information to build and maintain competitive advantages? Are these like hurdles that are just maybe overcome by creating public-private partnerships with like pre-competitive agreements, or some sort of, it require some sort of paradigm shift in the way that like companies will be operating, or something in between? Yeah.
I think this is a place where, and others may have views too, where the government has to think about what its mission is in protecting the rights of the citizens in the country, across the world in different scenarios. Companies are going to operate the way they operate. They're going to continue to operate that way within the bounds of the regulations and whatever standard practice is. Looking to see what it is we should be dividing that line between proprietary information that's relevant to protect commercializing a specific product versus base knowledge that's required to kind of enable that, which is more of a national security question or national interest in its economy question. I think it's in finding that right balance, and then exploring mechanisms in real time, right? Like the economy's moving, things are happening. We can't stop what we're doing, but how do we use pre-competitive tools? How do we think about what the IP landscape should look like? I mean, we've seen changes in how we can patent a gene. Like, this is important, right? Because it allows people to operate in the base space to figure out what those products are that they're going to build proprietarily. So I think it's that balance between the two that's going to be required.
I think there's a certain amount of the kind of economy of learning I was talking about was was kind of narrow at that moment in this conversation, because it reflected to, say, the distributed manufacturing. So you could imagine that means if it was, say, being done with a 3D bioprinting mechanism of some sort, whoever sells either the printer or the cartridges or whatever, they could be pulling back the instrumenting and pulling back the information and aggregating it and getting the benefit as if they were running one huge manufacturing plant. So that can be done without necessarily sharing across corporate boundaries, as it were. Obviously, their customers would have to just accept that this was part of the deal. I think what we've transitioned to, so I'm just saying that amount of economy of learning can be achieved without changing the game. What we've transitioned to is, I think, Chris has identified, I'd really be interested in hearing what Nazish has to say on this one, this balance point between sort of, the value of public sharing and the importance, to the public, to the broader economy of that, versus also the value of creating incentives and maintaining the profitability of companies. And we sort of have a really great example of this. I guess, Chris, you sort of said, well, government should examine, and I'd say, and academia plays a huge role here too, because going back to norms, an example in my head, was I was at MIT when in the building, Richard Stallman was getting the free software movement going. And open source had existed before that, but not in the way that he really made it happen. And we've had a complete change. Now, at the time, there were really people that thought this is going to kill the goose that lays a golden egg, right? Nobody would be able to make money out of software anymore. However, this, in some sense, that ethos got instilled in generations of students, and as they moved into the marketplace, it got to the point software developers is just, they just expected to be able to share their software and take it, and when they moved to another place, et cetera. So they just expected whatever they wrote would be that way. So it's interesting how that became a change in the value and norms of that community of practitioners. And we got sharing at a level that, to be honest, I didn't imagine we would get that kind of transition. And if we did, anywhere near as quickly as it happened, which doesn't mean it was overnight, but, in a 5 to 10 year period, things completely changed. So these things can be done. It can't just be done from Washington, right? I mean, and at the end of the day, those of us that are actually at places like NSF and at policy places, et cetera, we're just folks that are often, on loan from the community to be in the government policy world, and we're rotating through. I do think we need to instill the sense of the value of sharing data in particular in a broader community, and we also need to get the balance right here, so it's still possible for companies to go out and be profitable, et cetera, and there's still an incentive for people to commercialize the results. And we got a ton of sharing in the software space without killing the goose.
I'll be really quick with my answer. I do want to point out that the pharma industry kind of has tackled this question to a degree, right? It's not perfect by no means, but at least there's an example out there that you can do a postmortem on and be like, what works, what doesn't work for this.
Perfect. Well, we are a little over time, but thank you everyone for attending our panel today. A huge thank you to our panelists for joining us to talk on this really interesting subject. A quick reminder, submissions are due January 13th. We hope to hear all of your great ideas, and thank you everyone for attending today.